It was a cold, rainy evening when I first encountered the old woman. I was on my way home from work, trudging through the wet streets with my umbrella barely holding up against the wind. My usual shortcut took me through an old, run-down part of the neighborhood, which was generally deserted at this hour. As I hurried past the dilapidated houses, I noticed a figure standing in the doorway of an abandoned house. It was an old woman, her hunched silhouette framed by the flickering light of a single candle. She looked out of place, her presence both eerie and inexplicable. Her clothes were tattered and old-fashioned, and her hair, white and stringy, clung to her face in wet strands. She was muttering something to herself, words I couldn't quite make out over the sound of the rain. Despite my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself slowing down, straining to hear what she was saying. As I drew closer, her muttering became clearer, a repetitive chant that sent shivers down my spine. She looked up suddenly, her eyes locking onto mine. They were a pale, almost milky white, and filled with an unsettling intensity. I stopped in my tracks, every instinct telling me to turn around and run. But before I could move, she spoke directly to me. "Young man," she rasped, her voice crackling like dry leaves, "beware the shadows that follow you. They are not what they seem." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain, and a sense of dread settled over me. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but my voice seemed to have deserted me. She pointed a bony finger at me, her hand shaking. "You must heed the warnings, or suffer the fate of those before you." Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the darkness of the abandoned house, leaving me standing there, soaked and bewildered. I hurried home, her words echoing in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, seemed magnified, filled with a sinister intent. I tried to convince myself it was just a strange encounter, that the old woman was simply delusional, but deep down, I felt an inexplicable fear. The next few days were uneventful, and I began to convince myself that the encounter had been a figment of my imagination, a result of an overworked mind. Then, one evening, I noticed something strange. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching unnaturally, and always at the corner of my vision. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. One night, as I was working late at my desk, I felt a sudden, intense chill. The room grew cold, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I looked up, and there she was, standing in the corner of the room, the old woman from the abandoned house. Her eyes glowed with an unearthly light, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "I warned you," she hissed, her voice echoing in the stillness. Panic surged through me, and I tried to move, but my body was frozen in place. She moved closer, her presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "The shadows have come for you," she whispered, and as she spoke, the darkness seemed to come alive, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. Just as I felt myself slipping away, the old woman vanished, and the room returned to normal. I was left gasping for breath, drenched in cold sweat. The encounter left me shaken to my core. I knew that she was not just a figment of my imagination. She was real, and her warnings were not to be taken lightly. I moved out of my apartment the next day, unable to shake the feeling that the shadows were still following me. Even now, in my new place, I feel her presence. Every flicker of a candle, Every unexpected shadow brings back the memory of that night. The old woman's words haunt me, a constant reminder that some encounters leave a mark that time cannot erase.
I had always enjoyed my evening runs. They provided a welcome escape from the grind of my daily routine, a chance to clear my mind and feel the fresh air against my skin. My neighborhood, lined with leafy trees and well-manicured lawns, always seemed safe and inviting. But one evening, everything changed. It was a cool autumn night, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. I had my headphones in, blasting my favorite playlist, as I jogged down the familiar streets. As I rounded a corner near a particularly dense thicket of bushes, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. I shrugged it off as just the cooling temperature and continued my pace. Suddenly, I noticed something moving in the bushes ahead. It was subtle at first, just a rustle of leaves. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued. As I got closer, the movement became more frantic. I pulled out my headphones, now fully alert. The rustling grew louder, more violent, as if something was struggling within the foliage. Before I could react, something leapt out of the bush. It was a blur of fur and claws, launching itself directly at me. I stumbled backward, barely managing to dodge the initial attack. The creature landed on the sidewalk with a menacing snarl, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was unlike any animal I had ever seen, large, with matted fur, elongated limbs, and a grotesque, almost humanoid face twisted into a snarl. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet. The creature lunged again, its claws swiping through the air where I had been just seconds before. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear its heavy breathing and the thud of its footsteps close behind me. I dashed through the neighborhood, my once safe haven now a labyrinth of fear. I made it to the nearest house and banged on the door, screaming for help. The porch light flickered on, and an elderly woman opened the door, her eyes wide with alarm. "Please, let me in. There's something chasing me." I gasped. She hesitated for a moment, but then quickly pulled me inside, slamming the door shut behind us. We stood there, listening. The creature's footsteps stopped just outside the door. There was a tense silence, followed by a low growl and the sound of claws scratching at the wood. The woman grabbed a phone and called the police, her hands trembling. "There's something out there," she whispered, her voice shaking. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the creature had vanished. They searched the area but found no trace of it. They took my statement, clearly skeptical, but professional. I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was either crazy or had misinterpreted an encounter with a wild animal. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling of those glowing eyes boring into me. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual, but the memory of that night haunted me. I avoided the area near the bushes and stopped running in the evenings. I installed extra locks on my doors and even considered getting a dog for protection. Despite my efforts to move on, the sense of being watched never left me. Then, one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a familiar rustling outside my window. My heart froze, and I slowly approached, peeking through the curtains. There, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, I saw it, the same creature, its eyes glowing eerily in the darkness, staring directly at me. It hadn't forgotten me. It was still out there, waiting. From that moment on, I knew I could never truly feel safe again. The once comforting shadows of my neighborhood have become a constant source of dread, and the creature's presence lingered in every dark corner, every rustling bush. It was out there, always watching, always waiting for another chance to attack.
It was a typical Thursday evening, and I had just finished dinner. I was settling into my usual routine of catching up on emails and unwinding with a bit of TV when I heard a strange noise coming from the garage. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling or perhaps the wind. But the noise came again, louder this time, a sort of scraping, shuffling sound that set my nerves on edge. I paused the show I was watching and listened intently. The sound continued, irregular but persistent. My first thought was that an animal had somehow gotten into the garage, living on the outskirts of town. It wasn't uncommon for raccoons or stray cats to find their way into the more secluded parts of my property. I grabbed a flashlight and headed towards the garage, mentally preparing myself to chase out whatever creature had decided to make my home its own. The garage door creaked as I opened it, and I was immediately struck by how cold and damp it felt inside. I swept the flashlight beam around, illuminating the cluttered space. Everything seemed normal at first glance. My car was parked where I had left it, and the shelves were lined with the usual assortment of tools and boxes. But then, the light fell on something that made my stomach twist. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an old workbench, was a dark shape. It was large, hunched over, and vaguely humanoid. For a moment, I thought it was some sort of bizarre statue, or maybe a shadow cast by something outside. But then it moved. The thing shifted slightly, and I saw a glint of eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The creature seemed to sense my fear and began to rise, its movements slow and deliberate. As it stood, I saw that it was covered in matted fur or perhaps thick, coarse hair. Its limbs were long and gaunt, ending in gnarled hands with sharp, claw-like fingers. I tried to back away slowly, my mind racing with panic. "What the hell are you?" I whispered, more to myself than to the creature. It let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, deep and resonant, almost vibrating in my bones. Realizing I needed to get out of there, I turned and bolted for the door. As I reached it, I heard the creature moving behind me, its claws scraping against the concrete floor. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear anything else. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what I had just seen. Grabbing my phone, I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. They assured me they would send someone over right away, but those minutes waiting felt like an eternity. I could hear the creature still moving around in the garage, the sound of things being knocked over, and what almost sounded like whispering murmurs that I couldn't quite make out. When the police arrived, I felt a surge of relief. I led them to the garage and watched as they opened the door, flashlights and weapons ready. They swept the area thoroughly, but to my astonishment, there was no sign of the creature. The garage was exactly as I had left it, save for a few tools scattered on the floor. The officers looked at me with a mix of concern and skepticism. They suggested it might have been a wild animal that had since escaped, or perhaps even my imagination playing tricks on me. I knew what I had seen, but there was no evidence to back up my story. They left, assuring me that they would keep an eye on the area. 4 weeks after, I avoided the garage as much as possible, only going in during the day and never alone. The memory of that night lingered, the image of those eyes, and the sound of that growl haunting my thoughts. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint shuffling sounds coming from the garage, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was is still out there, waiting.